Hello, my name is Darren Goodweiler, and today I'm going to talk about the 8 essential elements of a loss prevention and risk management program that I call the 8 Ds. The 8 Ds aren't anything new. Every successful security professional has used a form of this system to assess or to develop their security operation. I've just simplified the process down to 8 key elements that have worked for me and will hopefully work for you. The strategic goal of any security operation is to identify threats or risks and to implement countermeasures to address those threats or risks. So in front of you, you see the 8 Ds of risk management. I've broken the risk management process down into 8 basic elements or processes, regardless of how simple or complex the location is or the item is that you're protecting or worried about from a loss prevention standpoint. If you break it out using this methodology and effectively apply what you have identified, your facility or the thing that you're protecting will be secure. So the first D of the 8 Ds is to define what you're protecting or evaluating. In order to start any type of risk management or loss prevention program, you need to clearly define what it is you're protecting or evaluating. Clearly articulating the scope of your mission will also clarify any misconceptions when countermeasures are implemented. This is the foundational component of the process. The first D is the foundation, and every D after that builds onto there. So you need to really develop an exhaustive list of potential targets that needs protecting. So things such as employees or a certain person, assets, business reputation, business continuity, stock price, cost and return on investment, intellectual property, any number of things, and any number of things within those should be developed as an exhaustive list, so you have a very clear understanding of what it is that you need to protect. You can't start any other part of your loss prevention or risk management program until you've clearly and completely identified everything it is that you're protecting or evaluating. What is the first D? Define what you're protecting. The second D is to determine the risk. So once you've determined what it is that needs to be protected, you must have a clear understanding of any potential threats or risks or vulnerabilities associated with that thing that you're protecting. If you underestimate the risk, the result could be catastrophic. If you overestimate the risk, you've spent time and resources unnecessarily when they could have been used more effectively at another location or in another area. The formula that I've developed to determine the risks is threats times vulnerabilities times impact of loss. I'll cover each of these areas in greater detail in the following slides. What is the second D? Determine the risk. So as I mentioned earlier, the formula is threats times vulnerabilities times impact of loss. So the first part of that is the threat. The threat score is measured by evaluating the probability or likelihood and the possibility or the adversary opportunity of an event from happening. The threat is based on the best available intelligence. The score is an average of the probability and the possibility. The graph is scored from 1 being low and 4 being high. The highest possible score, again this is an average, that somebody could get on this is a 4. So if you had a possibility of 2 and a probability of 2, the average is 2. If you had a 4 and a 4, obviously the average would be 4. So again, the highest number you could get from a threat perspective would be 4. The second component of the formula is vulnerabilities. So the vulnerability score is measured by evaluating the target attractiveness from the adversary's perspective and the existing countermeasures, or how hard your target is. The score is based on an average of the existing countermeasures and target attractiveness. The graph is scored from 1 to 4, just as the previous, the threats graph. So again, 4 from a target attractiveness and a 4 from an existing countermeasures standpoint still comes up to a 4 as the highest. So target attractiveness, again, is from the adversary's perspective. So how much risk am I willing to take, and how attractive is that thing that I want to get to or to do damage to? How attractive is that target? And the existing countermeasures is what is in place to prohibit me, again from the adversary's perspective, of accomplishing what it is that I'm trying to get done. And the third component of the formula is impact of loss. So it's scored from 1 to 4. 1, again, being the lowest impact of loss. If you're talking about, it could be anything from slight injury, if at all, minimal financial or property loss to a corporation. And again, this is the least, 1 is the lowest score you can get. And again, it's the least amount of impact to what it is that you're protecting. And then it scales up to moderate, and then serious, and then 4 being the most catastrophic issue, loss of life, extreme property damage, financial loss that would completely close down a corporation. Again, we're looking at something significant that would go on. So if you look at this, 4 being the highest number, 1 being the lowest number. So once your score is obtained in all 3 categories, all 3 need to be multiplied together to create your total risk score. So the highest possible score that you could obtain would be a 64. So that would be 4, which would be your threat score, 4 your vulnerability score, times 4 your impact of loss. So 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. 64 being the highest potential score that you could obtain, or the worst case scenario, actually, if you look at it from that perspective. So I developed a scenario here. And I just took a fictional operation and made some assumptions here as we go through here, but this is an example. So you have a manufacturing facility that is a traditional manufacturing facility in the Midwest. A psychologically unstable former employee enters a door in the plant that's always propped open. Now, all the doors should be closed and locked and secured, but for some reason, because it's summertime and they don't have HVAC in the building or whatever, they prop the door open to allow ventilation. The former employee's intent is to shoot his former supervisor because the former supervisor did something that the former employee attributes was a reason for his termination. The former employee was psychologically unstable, goes into a propped open door, and he shoots his former supervisor because of a termination. Unfortunately, this scenario has played out in several active shooter situations throughout the United States recently. So let's score this. Unfortunately, the possibility of this happening in warmer months is very high. In a lot of manufacturing facilities, doors are continually left open or propped open without anybody watching who's entering. If someone does enter the facility, they're usually not challenged. Oftentimes, security departments do several workplace violence cases a year, and sometimes employees are terminated before appropriate behaviors are identified and reported through the system. Oftentimes employees don't have an appropriate badging system, and the employees are afraid to get engaged and to challenge somebody that's coming onto their property that they don't necessarily identify. So if you look at the possibility and the probability of it happening is very high. In fact, it's recently happened. And the probability of happening is pretty high. So again, this comes to an average of 4. The target of attractiveness of the supervisor, the former employee, psychologically unstable, attributes the loss of their job not to their poor performance or not to their inappropriate behavior potentially, but they attribute their loss of work to their supervisor, the person who delivered the message that they were being terminated. So the target of attractiveness, as far as the supervisor goes, is high, and if you leave the doors open and don't wear identification and don't report appropriate or inappropriate behavior in the workplace, the existing countermeasures are extremely low or non-existent. So again, from the adversary's perspective, this is a 4. If the former employee is successful in assassinating or killing their former supervisor, this is also scored as a 4 from an impact of loss, because you have loss of life. And you're also going to have some other issues associated with that, from potentially an OSHA standpoint to say that you failed to create a safe work environment, maybe from negligent, some other type of negligence litigation, because you have done something inappropriate or your employees aren't effectively trained or equipped to deal with a situation like this. The target of attractiveness of the supervisor, the former employee, psychologically unstable, attributes the loss of their job not to their poor performance or not to their inappropriate behavior potentially, but they attribute their loss of work to their supervisor, the person who delivered the message that they were being terminated. So the target of attractiveness, as far as the supervisor goes, is high, and if you leave the doors open and don't wear identification and don't report appropriate or inappropriate behavior in the workplace, the existing countermeasures are extremely low or non-existent. So again, from the adversary's perspective, this is a 4. If the former employee is successful in assassinating or killing their former supervisor, this is also scored as a 4 from an impact of loss, because you have loss of life. And you're also going to have some other issues associated with that, from potentially an OSHA standpoint to say that you failed to create a safe work environment, maybe from negligent, some other type of negligence litigation, because you have done something inappropriate or your employees aren't effectively trained or equipped to deal with a situation like this. So your total score in this particular scenario is a 64 for threat, for vulnerability, and for impact of loss. So what could have been done to potentially lower this score? They could have identified the employee behavior prior to terminating the employee and reported to Human Resources. We found time and time again that people just don't snap. There are pre-incident indicators, and if you look at a lot of the case histories of active shooter situations, whether it's the Virginia Tech shooting or the Fort Hood shooting, and other cases, there were all kinds of pre-incident indicators that could have been caught, that could have given us early detection capabilities, that could have been passed on to Human Resources, that we could have addressed those situations before terminating the employee, so we didn't have to worry about them coming back and doing this type of behavior. They could have kept all the doors secure, so that would have forced the adversary to come through some type of screening process, maybe through a lobby or something that had an emergency security capability. They could have challenged anyone not wearing identification. Again, if this former employee comes in and he didn't have an identification badge, which he wouldn't have once he was terminated, and the employees challenged him, at least they would have stopped the adversary. And if his intended target was the supervisor, maybe that would have been enough to keep him from getting to that supervisor. Immediately report all security violations. Anytime somebody comes into the location and they don't have any identification, that could have been, again, you could have started calling 911 when the guy's walking in the facility earlier on. And follow all security policies and procedures. So once you've scored your risk and you've developed that threats times vulnerabilities times impact of loss, and you come up with a 64, or whatever the number is you come up with, anything from a 1 to a 64, you have to decide what you're going to do with that particular situation, or what your risk treatment's going to be. So there's 3 potential things you can do with it. You can amputate it, you can avoid it, or you can accept it. Risk amputation is that you're not going to take that risk. You're going to back out of a risky situation. This could be applicable. An example is if you're looking at acquiring a business or doing business in a certain part of the world, and in that particular part of the world there's a high preponderance or a high situation associated with kidnappings and ransom and or some type of significant domestic violence situation where it's just going to be too cost prohibitive to put security in place to open up that operation there. So your cost benefit analysis, or however you've measured your risk, you've said that it's too risky and we're not going to go down that path. So the risk amputation. There's also risk avoidance or risk transfer. That's the second treatment. So in this capacity, you insure against your risk or insure against your loss, or you outsource it. You come up with somebody else to manufacture in that location, or you transfer your risk. And then the third treatment which is normally taken, is you accept the risk. You say, okay, we understand what the risks are associated with what we're trying to do or who we're trying to protect or whatever it is that we're doing, and we're going to accept that risk. We understand what it is, and we're going to go forward. So to do that now, then you have to put policies and procedures and potentially equipment in place from a security perspective or from a loss prevention standpoint. And then compliance management. So policies and procedures and equipment in and of themselves aren't necessarily effective unless you have a compliant society. So the idea is, like for example, in a prison, you have a complete non-compliant group of folks in there that you're securing. So because there's complete non-compliance, then you need to have pretty significant policies and procedures and equipment, jail cells and different things to do to secure it. But if you have a complete compliant society, then you can get by with less security policies and procedures and equipment. So again, a lot of it has to do with your compliance management associated with the things that you're putting in place from your risk acceptance standpoint. So what's your third D? Decide to amputate, avoid, or accept. Your fourth D is to deter the adversary. So the idea is to, assuming that you've decided to accept the risk, so this is our third risk treatment, you've decided to accept the risk, now what you have to do is to deter the adversary from attacking. This is your, deterrents are usually the first line of defense. The idea is to make the thing that you're protecting appear extremely distasteful and hazardous from the adversary's perspective. If deterrents are effective, the adversary will discontinue pursuing their objective. From a physical security perspective, deterrents are located on the outermost edge of your perimeter. Deterrents are often the first thing your adversary will see when they're targeting your operation or when they're selecting the target. So the idea is to make the goal is to make what they're looking at or surveilling very unattractive. And oftentimes it's called target hardening. From the adversary's perspective, you want them to look at the difficulty versus the risk, and the risk versus success. Again, from a physical security standpoint, this would be perimeter lighting, signage, those types of things. In it from when at your house, that would be putting ADT signs out in the yard. So if somebody's looking and driving through a neighborhood to look at potential victims, they're going to look at the house that doesn't have the appropriate security things at it, and they're going to go hunt something or attack something that's much weaker, that has a much less of a risk from their perspective. What is the fourth D? Deter the adversary. The fifth D is to detect and assess the attack. If the adversary wasn't swayed by the deterrence you put in place, you want to know an attack is underway as soon as possible. Detection by itself is not effective. You must have assessed detection to be able to dispatch the necessary resources. Just because an alarm goes off, you don't know whether or not you have a problem. It's only after you have verified or assessed that the alarm is valid that you know you have a real problem. For example, many of us have stayed in hotel rooms, and sometimes there is a fire alarm that goes off, and unfortunately, oftentimes you open up the door and you look down the hallway to see if there's any smoke, and if there's not, you're thinking that somebody was doing something in the room, and oftentimes they don't, unfortunately, evacuate when they should. And shortly after that, there's usually something that comes over the PA system that says it was just a test, or it's been mitigated, or something's going on. That's not a problem. However, if the smoke detector goes off and you look out the hallway and there's fire or there's smoke, you now have detection with assessment. So you hear the smoke alarm, you hear the smoke detector, you see the smoke, you have detection, it's been detected, and you have personally assessed it. Another example of that is you're at your residence and you hear somebody trying to bang on your front door. And so you have detection, you have that noise, your dogs are barking, whatever it happens to be, that's detection. So then you look out a side window or you look out another door and you see that somebody is in fact, a bad guy is trying to break in your door to get in your house. Now you have detection with assessment. In the 1800s, actually in the early 1800s, few jobs were harder or more dangerous than working in an underground coal mine. Over the years, thousands of men and women and even children were killed in those accidents associated with that. One of the common causes of those accidents were a buildup of gases such as methane and carbon monoxide in the mine shafts. Large amounts of these gases could lead to violent explosions and kill several people. The miners in the 1800s didn't have any type of special equipment scientists have today to measure chemicals in the air. So it was impossible to tell if the gases were building up to dangerous levels. Miners started using canaries to test the air quality in the mines. Canaries, they're physiologically more sensitive to carbon monoxide and other gases. And the canaries would chirp and sing most of the time, and they'd sing along all day. But when the canaries stopped singing, the levels were too high, the canaries would have trouble breathing or maybe even die. But those levels were small enough that it was still okay for the human beings. But when the canaries would stop singing, miners would know that the gas levels were too high or they were rising quickly, and they would leave the mine quickly enough to avoid being caught in an explosion. In this capacity, canaries provided detection and assessment. What is the fifth D? Detect and assess the attack. The sixth D is to dispatch responders equal or greater to your adversary. Once you've validated that you have a problem, so you've detected and assessed the attack, you need to dispatch the appropriate resources to address the situation. If you have a water leak, you send a plumber. If you have a fire, you send firefighters. And if you have armed assailants, you send armed and tactically trained responders. This is when you find out if you've accurately determined your risk. It's critical to establish relationships with identified responders prior to an event taking place. The more you work with your responders, the better your understanding will be of their capabilities and tactics. Additionally, your responders will have a higher level of situational awareness and familiarity with your site. So the idea is, with a lot of these active shooter situations that have been occurring lately, you want to make sure that you have worked with your local police department. If you have hazardous materials on your site, that you've worked with your local fire departments. If you're looking at from a loss prevention standpoint, that you work with your loss prevention folks, and you have the ability to dispatch people that are greater, or some type of countermeasure that is greater or equal to your adversary. What is the 6th D? Dispatch responders. The 7th D is to delay the attack until the responders can arrive and stop the threat. So you've detected and assessed your threat, or you've detected and assessed an attack of some sort. You've called 911, or you've dispatched what it is that your responders are set there to do. And now you need to delay the attack until the responders can arrive and stop the threat. So depending upon how far away your responders are, there will be a certain amount of time the adversary will go without facing your responders. Physical barriers and other countermeasures must be in place. This is called target hardening, to create a delay for the adversary, to give your responders time to effectively engage the adversary before they can accomplish their objective. The key is to maximize the delay of your adversary and minimize the delay of your responders. So to look at this from your residents, the scenario I talked about earlier, where you have detect assessment, you have somebody trying to break in your door of your residence. And you know that where you live, when you call 911, the police responders are 5 minutes away. So what you have to do is you have to make sure that the door that you have in place is hard enough, or the locks or the barriers that you have in your residence, or whatever countermeasures you have in place, can keep somebody outside for at least 5 minutes, so the responders can get there in time. Or you need to have something else inside the residence to make sure that whatever it is, that you can delay the bad guys long enough for the good guys to get there. What is the 7th D? Delay the attack. The 8th D is defeat the adversary. The ultimate goal of the whole 8D program is to completely defeat the adversary before they can accomplish their task, while minimizing damage to your facility or the people you're protecting, or whatever it is that you're protecting. The adversary is not defeated until the operation is returned to normal. You must determine how to measure normalcy. This time is also an opportunity to evaluate your plan to see if you correctly identified what you were protecting and if your risk scoring was accurate. So after you have an attack, is the time to look through the entire process, look at your 8Ds again and say, okay, did we truly identify what it was we were protecting? Did we understand what the threat was to what it was that we were protecting, and scored effectively? Did we have effective deterrence in place? Did we have a good dispatch capability and mechanism? Did we have appropriate delays in place, or did we have situational awareness? Did we have a good 8D process put in place? Returning to normalcy is you have to have some mechanism to understand whether or not you've returned to normalcy. If you had an active shooter type of situation in the workplace, are there rumors? Is there attendance issues? Is there work comp issues? Productivity? Has things returned to normal? And you may have a new normal. It may not be after 9/11. The new normal was looking at, we never thought before that people would use airplanes as weapons to fly into buildings in the United States, because it hadn't happened until then. So our new normal is a new understanding that we have a potential new threat associated with terrorism. So that is our new normal. And again, looking at lessons learned. So what is the 8th D? defeat the adversary. So to recap the 8 Ds, the first D is to define what you're protecting. The second D is to determine the risk. The third D is to decide to amputate, avoid, or accept. The fourth D is to deter the adversary. The fifth D is to detect and assess the attack. The sixth D is to dispatch responders. The seventh D is to delay the attack. And the eighth D is to defeat the adversary. Thank you for your time. This concludes the presentation, and you may now take the test.